I think that's very important. So with that said, let's go to Genesis. It's in Isaiah, if you want to write these verses down. It's in Isaiah chapter 46, verse 10. It said, God declared the end from the beginning, from the ancient times, things that are not yet done. Do you realize if he declared the end from the beginning, if you really want to understand the book of Revelation, you got to read Genesis. But the problem is we don't see the end in the beginning, but the end is actually all over in the beginning when you know how to look at it. So if we really want to understand end times, we have to start in the book of Genesis. Now, when God created the sun and the moon, many of us think that he created it because we needed light and heat. I mean, it is true, we do need light and heat. But as you take a closer look at the text, you're going to find in Genesis chapter 1, verse 14, there are really 4 other reasons why he created them. And if you have your Bibles with you, you can turn to Genesis 1:14. But it said that God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night. And then it says this. It says, let them be for signs. God created the sun and the moon to send signals to us. And then it says, let them be for signs, for seasons, for days and years. The Hebrew word for signs here is ot. It's the aleph, the yud, or the aleph, vav, and the tav is how it's spelled. It's ot. And do you know what this word actually means? It means to be used as a signal or waving a flag. Remember the old saying, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea? So God created the sun and the moon to send signals. It's like he's going, hello, hello, eclipse, eclipse. That's why God created the sun and the moon. The number one reason he has here is to send us signals. The problem is we don't know how to read the signals, or when the signals have meaning or not. So one of the main reasons God created the lights was to send us signals. I can't help but think of a baseball coach who will wiggle his nose or touch his ear or something like that so the baseball runners know if they're supposed to run or try to steal or whatever. What happens if the runner forgets the signals or doesn't know the signals? They don't know how to respond. So this is why biblically we have to understand when God says he created things for signs, well, we have to know what these signs mean. What's interesting, if you look at the Strong's number for that word for signs, it's Strong's number 226, not only does it mean a sign, but it means in the sense of appearing, and it means to come. So it's almost like these are signals of the Lord's coming, is what this word implies. As a matter of fact, in Isaiah, this is in Isaiah chapter 13, verse 9 and 10, and you can see this is talking about the tribulation. It says, behold, the day of the Lord comes. It's cruel, both with wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate. He's going to destroy the sinners out of it. Then it says, the stars of heaven, the constellations will not give their light. The sun will be darkened in his going forth. The moon will not cause her light to shine. We know from Joel chapter 3, verse 15, it says, the sun and the moon shall be darkened, and the stars shall withdraw their shining. So imagine, here we have the night. We have these shooting stars. We may even have this big comet like Ison coming the end of this year. If you haven't heard about that comet, I'll be talking about it lately. But God created the sun, the moon, the stars, the heavens to not only declare the glory of God, but to send us signals. As a matter of fact, the Lord himself emphatically said in Luke chapter 21 to his disciples that there would be signs in the heavens before his coming. Here's Luke 21 and 25. It says, there shall be signs in the sun and the moon and in the stars, and upon the earth the stress of nations. And then it goes on to say, well, let me go back. Right before that, it says in Luke 21, verse 11, it says, there will be great earthquakes in diverse places, famines, pestilences, and fearful sights, and great signs shall there be from heaven. Now, why do you think Yeshua would be telling us that there is going to be signs in the sun and the moon and the stars? Because that's why he created them. That's what Genesis 1:14 says, God says, I created them to send signals. And then what does the Lord say? Guess what? There's going to be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars. I mean, this is just common sense. If that's what God said why he created them, why should we be surprised when the Lord himself says there's going to be signs? Makes sense. Okay, why would we believe any differently? Well, I'll tell you why. It's because people don't know the appointed times. They're not on God's calendar, but a pagan solar one, and so they don't make the connections. Do you remember what the Lord said to the unbelievers in his day? This is in Luke chapter 12, verse 56. He says, you bunch of hypocrites. You can discern the face of the sky and of the earth, but you don't discern the time. How do you know this is not, how can you not see that this is the time? And the problem is we're in the same situation. Look at what God declared in Jeremiah chapter 8. First, let me just show you this right here. God said, let there be lights in the firmament of heaven to divide the day from the night. Let them be for what? Signs. Luke 21:25, he says, there shall be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars. All right. But now let's go to Jeremiah. He's talking to Pharisees and all these unbelievers. He said, you bunch of hypocrites, you don't know the times. There's Jeremiah 8, chapter 7. It says, the stork in heaven knows her appointed times. The turtle dove and the crane and the swallow observe the time of their coming, but my people don't know the judgment of the Lord. The problem is the whales know when to migrate. The birds know when to migrate. They know their times, but God said, my people don't know their times. They're clueless. They're on the wrong calendar. And so if you consider yourself a student of Bible prophecy, but you're not on God's calendar, then you are like a ship in the middle of the ocean without any navigational equipment. In Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 1, it says, to everything there is a season, there is a time to every purpose under heaven. Well, how many of you know God purposed everything under heaven? So there's a time for everything. So my question to you is, what time is it? What time is it? Where are we on the prophetic calendar? Well, let's take a look at something. The very next thing, and the problem here is the English language again. In Genesis 1:14, it says, God says, I'm creating the sun and the moon for number one, for signs. And what was the second reason? For seasons. But do you know what the problem is? That's not what seasons mean in the Bible. It's the wrong translation. It has nothing to do with winter, spring, summer, or fall. Absolutely nothing. And so the problem is if we look at that and we think, gee, it means seasons, we're really going to be confused. The Hebrew word is moed, and it's translated to English as another equally ambiguous word in Leviticus 23. The very word that is translated as seasons in Genesis 1:14, that same word in Leviticus 23 is translated as feast. Now, what does winter, spring, summer, fall have to do with food? Absolutely nothing. And so that Hebrew word that is translated as seasons in Genesis, translated as feast in Leviticus, they're both wrong English words. And here you have the same word that the translator translated one way as season, one way as feast, and both are wrong. So this is what we need to look at. In Leviticus 23:2, it says, speak to the sons of Israel, say to them, the feasts of the Lord. Well, when we hear feasts, we think of food. When we hear seasons, we think of winter, spring, summer, fall. But that's the totally wrong thing we should be thinking about. When we think of feast, we're imagining some Thanksgiving banquet. Okay, with some big fat turkey and casseroles and pumpkin pies. But these words are about as far apart as you can get. Here we see moed, that's in the Hebrew. You see the mem, vav, ayin, dalet. Translated in Genesis 1:14 as seasons, Leviticus 23:2 as feasts. I'm sorry you can't see on the bottom, but what that literally means is divine appointments. It's like God has a day timer. And he's saying, I have an appointment with mankind. This is when I'm going to intersect human history. So in Genesis 1:14, a better translation would be, he created the sun and the moon to send signals on his divine appointments. On the divinely appointed days, like Passover, unleavened bread, Feast of First Fruits, Shabbat, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Tabernacles. Okay, so why did God create the sun, the moon, and the stars? For divine appointments, just like in Leviticus 23. These are the divine appointments of the Lord. How many of you, if your boss told you he wanted to have an appointment with you on Thursday at 2 o'clock, would you tell him, I'm sorry, that doesn't work in my schedule, let's make it Friday at 4? How long are you going to be employed? Okay, who sets the appointments? The boss does. Okay? Well, it's the same thing. God sets the appointments. God says, here's when I'm going to meet with you. How many of you believe in divine appointments? Guess what? There's some that are scheduled. Why would you not want to be at the scheduled ones? When God says, I'm definitely going to be there. At this time, on this day, I'm going to be there. I don't know about you, but I want to be there. Think about it from this standpoint. Is God everywhere? Okay. Now, in the wilderness, where you had the cloud of glory and the fire by night, that was God's presence, wasn't it? Was there a cloud of glory and a fire by night in China? Does that mean God wasn't there? God was in China, but he was in the wilderness in a very special way. Okay? So the divine appointments, you may say, well, I can meet God whenever I want to, any day I want to, anytime I want to. Yeah, okay, whatever. But I tell you what, if you want to meet him in a very special way, you need to be where he wants you to be at this time, and you're going to see some phenomenal things happen. So yes, you can meet God anywhere, anytime, but I tell you what, when he sets the day and the time that he'll meet with you, why would you want to miss that appointment? And he will be there in a very special way. He's not there at other times on other days. The feasts of the Lord were always to be considered as divine appointments that God predetermined as to when he would intersect human history. In Revelations, God said that Messiah was slain from the foundation of the world. When it says he was slain from the foundation of the world, what this is saying is the Father knew the year, the month, the day, the exact hour that Yeshua would die. Do you think Yeshua died and the Father went, oh, good grief, we got to go to plan B? That's not what happened. He had it all planned out from the very beginning. He knew what day Yeshua was going to die, what time he was going to die. You know, the Father even picked what songs were going to be sung at his funeral. I can tell you the songs that were sung. Okay, God is very detailed. But here's the important thing. And I think this is so important. We just got done reading in Genesis 1:14. God created the sun and the moon for signs and what? Seasons. Okay? Signs and seasons. And signs mean signals. The word seasons mean for his divine appointments. Right? With that understanding, look at 1 Thessalonians 5, chapter 1. What is Paul saying? Concerning the times and the seasons, brethren, you don't have any need I should write to you. Why does he say that to them? They know the times and the seasons. They understand that it means a divine appointment, not seasons. So now listen to 1 Thessalonians 5, 2 through 4. You have to realize who he's speaking to. He's speaking to people who know the festivals of the Lord, the divine appointments. And look what the rest of it says. You yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord comes as a thief in the night. How many of you have heard that before? Everyone says, oh, right there it says the Lord comes as a thief in the night. We're all supposed to be stupid. That's not what it says. Look at this. For when they say peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes upon them as labor pains upon a pregnant woman, and they shall not escape. Now listen to this next line. But you, brethren, are not in darkness, that that day will overtake you as a thief. Why will that day not overtake you as a thief? Because you understand the times and the seasons. I don't have time to go into it, but everywhere that he says that he comes as a thief in the night, or you won't know the day and the hour, you have to look at who he's talking to. He's talking to the lukewarm church of Laodicea in Revelation. He's talking to the foolish virgins. He's talking to the evil servants. When he says you won't know the day and the hour, look at who he's talking to. But the problem is we've been on the wrong calendar. What does them mean? Okay, it says in Genesis 1:14, he created the sun and the moon for signs. Oh, he says, let them be for signs and seasons. What does them mean? All right, well, here's what's important. God declared that the sun and the moon were also to determine the days and the years. So when we first read this, we skip over the word signs. We see seasons, days, and years, and we think winter, spring, summer, fall, and our normal calendar days and our normal years. But that's a false understanding. This had nothing to do with our pagan calendar. Our calendar is created by a pagan Roman ruler. It was known as the Julian calendar by Julius Caesar. Okay, it's totally based on the sun. This is why we have to add one day every 4 years, February 29th, right? Everyone's familiar with the leap year, to keep everything in line with the sun. The Muslim calendar is based totally on the moon. This is why Ramadan will be in November one year, and it might be in July, it could be in April, because it's based on the moon. But God said, when it comes to my calendar, let them be. It's based on the sun and the moon. The biblical calendar is a lunar solar calendar. So I want us to think in terms of God having a day timer. He makes appointments of when he wants to meet with each and every one of us. And so here, I've got this picture of a watch. And we see here, we got the Muslim timepiece. We're not on that one. We're not on our pagan Roman timepiece. We need to be on the Torah timepiece. Okay? So when we want to know what time it is, we need to follow the festival time clock. This is why on the biblical calendar, just like we add a leap day every 4 years, on the Jewish calendar, the biblical calendar, they add an entire month 7 times over about 19 years. And this is based on the cycle of the moon. Okay? And then, so they have to adjust it to keep up with the sun and the moon. So they add an entire month 7 times over 19 years. That's what keeps Passover, because Passover had to be kept in the spring. And if they weren't using a lunar solar calendar, if they only used the lunar calendar, Passover would end up in December. So this is why they use not a solar calendar, not a lunar calendar, but a lunar solar calendar. Now, when it says also for days and years, what were they talking about? They were talking about the holy days. They were talking about the year of Jubilee. They were talking about the Shemitah year, every 7th year that the land was to rest. So God created these things for the biblical holy holidays, okay, and not for the pagan holidays. Now, here's the thing. If you live in a certain time zone, for example, I used to live in Garden City, Kansas, which was like right here on this border. And in Garden City, people had to have 2 clocks. Because you could drive 1 mile and it'd take you an hour, and that's not counting Seattle-type traffic. You had to have 2 clocks because you would live in one time zone and work in another time zone. Unless you've experienced that, you're not really aware of what it's like to live on the border of a time zone. Well, here's the thing. If you wanted to meet with someone for coffee, you have to say, well, you talking Colorado time or Kansas time, Central or Mountain, so you could meet. Otherwise, you might get there an hour early or an hour late. It's the same thing when people call us from around the world at the offices or from around the United States. You know, they may call it 8 in the morning their time, but that could be 5 in the morning our time and no one's there. We've been talking about connections, how important it is to connect. If you want to connect someone, you got to make sure you're on the same time, schedule. Doesn't matter, you know, as far as our communication goes, which one we're on, but we have to agree. The very idea of a feast, the divine appointment, also implies a wedding. Okay, what happens if the bride and groom don't communicate what day and what time they're going to get married together, or they disagree? It ain't happening. Okay, so how many of you want to be part of the bride of the Messiah? Anybody here want to be part of the bride of the Messiah? Don't you think it'd be a good idea to be at the dress rehearsal? At the wedding rehearsal. That's what the feasts are. The Magi, they understood the significance of the signs in the heavens tied to God's divine appointments. This is why in Matthew chapter 2, it says they were looking for he that is born King of the Jews because they had seen his star in the east and they had come to worship him. And you know what's amazing? This is in Psalms chapter 104, verse 19. It says, God appointed the moon for seasons. And the word seasons there, again, is not winter, spring, summer, fall. It's for the feast days, the divine appointments. So God created and he appointed the moon specifically to determine when the feast days were. Now, one of the most important things to remember concerning the feasts of the Lord in Leviticus 23 is to who they belong to. It goes to say in Leviticus 23:2, speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, the feasts of the Lord, which you shall proclaim, are to be holy convocations. Even these are my appointed feasts. All too often in Christianity, we say, oh, those are the feasts of the Jews. Discard them, throw them out, trash them, put them into the trash bin of history. That's all old. Nowhere does it say the feast of the Jews. These are the feasts of the Lord. He says, these are my feasts. Think about that. God is the one who's the boss who sets the appointments in the day-timer. Now, he's invited the Jews to come and participate. That doesn't make it the feast of the Jews or the appointments of the Jews. It was the appointment of God, and if they don't want to come, that's their problem, but I sure it. If you belong to the Lord, then the feast belong to you. So it's very important to realize that they're his feasts. Even in Exodus chapter 12, verse 11, concerning the Passover, it says, and thus shall you eat it with your loins girded, your shoes on your feet, your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. It doesn't say it's the Jewish Passover. It says it's the Lord's Passover. It belongs to him. It's all too often from an anti-Semitic viewpoint that we relegate all the feasts of the Lord to the trash bin of history. But what does Colossians say? These things are shadows of things to come, which means that haven't arrived yet. Which brings me to the next point. The feasts were also called in Leviticus 23 holy, which means what? Set apart, convocations. Now, what does convocation mean? It means an assembly. But what's fascinating, the Hebrew word here is mikra, and it implies a dress rehearsal. Okay, so for every year, God told them around 1500 BC, they were to slay the Passover lamb on Passover at 3 in the afternoon. So every year, the Jews are killing the Passover lamb on Passover at 3 in the afternoon. And when do you think Jesus died? On Passover at 3 in the afternoon. He didn't die in July. He didn't die in December. So every year, they were doing the dress rehearsal of what was to come. Okay? Well, that's what the fall feasts are. They're the dress rehearsal of what's coming at his second coming. I mean, I can't help but think about this. Yom Teruah, the Feast of Trumpets, when we come together, we blow the shofar 100 times. Okay, that's traditionally what is done. The last blast is known as the last trump. When Paul referred to at the last trump, we shall all be changed, he's talking about the Feast of Trumpets. And so every year on the Feast of Trumpets, we are worshiping the King, honoring the King, we're blowing the shofars, but we have to realize, just like the tabernacle on earth was patterned after the one in heaven, they are also practicing his coming in heaven. The angels are there blowing shofars and practicing. Can you imagine? If something's important, you're going to rehearse it, right? Just like at a wedding. Well, can you imagine in the heavens, do you think they're not practicing the second coming of the Messiah when everyone is worshiping him and praising him? Man, they are practicing. This is the King of Kings who created the universe. Talk about honor. Just like if some governor or king or president was coming and we were going to honor him, we'd want to make sure everyone knew where they were going to stand, what they were going to do, and rehearse everything so it's ready. Well, that's what they're doing in heaven. And so on that day, while they're doing it in heaven, we're supposed to be practicing it on earth. And again, think about what it's going to be like one of these days on the Feast of Trumpets. We're there honoring and praising the King and blowing the shofar, and the next thing we know, we're going to be in the presence, and we're going to fit right in. It's going to be, it's just boom, all of it. It's not going to be shock and awe so much. We're going to be there. Okay. So let's think again at the first two reasons of why God created the sun and the moon. He created them to do what? To send signals on his divine appointments. That's how you need to read Genesis 1:14. You know, all the holy days. Now this is huge. Now let me ask you something. How many of you believe that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever? Okay? Oftentimes Christians have and I don't mean to say this negatively, I don't know what the right term is, but oftentimes we have a knee-jerk response of course he is. But I ask you to look deeper into your heart and ask you, do you really, really believe that he is the same yesterday, today, and forever? If you really, really believe that, if you honestly answered yes, then I've got to tell you something that I hope will rock your theological world. If God is really the same yesterday, today, and forever, if he fulfilled the spring feast to the very day of his first coming, he would fulfill the fall feast to the very day of his second coming. The feast of Passover was fulfilled on Passover. Unleavened bread was fulfilled on unleavened bread. He rose on a Jewish feast of first fruits. Okay? Shavuot or Pentecost happened on Pentecost. This is why in Acts it says there were Jews from every nation there because they had to be there. I mean, that's why they were there. And remember, Peter said these guys aren't drunk. It's the third hour of the day. Well, that's 9 in the morning, time of the morning sacrifice. So here at 9 in the morning, at the time of the morning sacrifice, all the Jews, they weren't in the upper room, guys. They were in the temple. That was the house of God. God said, make my house a house of prayer. They weren't in the upper room of the house. They were at the temple. They had to be there at 9 in the morning, the time of the morning sacrifice. And then the Spirit is poured out on everybody there, and you can't get 3,000 people in an upper room. Okay? They were at the temple. But it happened on Pentecost. So if all these things happened to the day for his spring feast to be fulfilled, why wouldn't we think he fulfilled the fall feast? And they have to happen in order. The Holy Spirit cannot be poured out in Acts until he rose from the dead. He's not going to rise from the dead until he dies. Okay? He's got to be buried first. They're not going to bury him before he's dead. Well, same thing with the fall feast. The Feast of Trumpets has to be fulfilled first on the Feast of Trumpets. Then Yom Kippur has to be fulfilled on Yom Kippur. Then Tabernacles has to be fulfilled on Tabernacles. Okay? And we have DVDs where I go through prophetically what will happen on those days. But if something happens, but it doesn't happen on those days, there's no connection. You have to be on God's calendar to know when these things happen, to know that it's God that's doing this. It's not some random event. In Revelation chapter 13, again, it says that Yeshua was slain from the foundation of the world. So this is telling us that God planned everything in advance. What we need to do is hear and understand what the Lord's trying to tell us in our day. So, with this new understanding, we see that God specifically created the sun, the moon, and the stars to send signals to his children at his appointed times so we would be aware that significant events are going to be unfolding. I mean, God always wants to warn his kids. Why do you think in the book of Joel, Isaiah, Revelation, as well as Jesus himself in the Gospels would declare there would be signs in the sun and the moon and the stars? This is common sense. He created them that way. Now, in case you didn't know this from a scientific standpoint, this is important, because some people think there was this total solar eclipse when Jesus died on Passover. That was impossible. It was not a solar eclipse. That's not why it was dark. First off, solar eclipses don't last 3 hours. Okay? But here's the thing. You can only have a total solar eclipse on the first day of a biblical month. It only can happen at a new moon. You can only scientifically have a total lunar eclipse in the middle of a biblical month, like the 15th. Okay? That's the only time that a lunar eclipse can occur. Now think about this for a minute. How many of you knew or know that God probably had that figured out? Do you think God, oh, gee, man, I should have thought about that? Okay. God knew you can only have a solar eclipse on the first of a biblical month. He knew you can only have a total lunar eclipse on the 15th, the middle of a biblical month. So why do you think he put Passover and Tabernacles in the middle of the month? He could have put Passover on the 7th of the month or the 20th of the month. He purposely put it on the 14th, 15th of Nisan, the first day of unleavened bread, Passover, and the 15th for Tabernacles, because he wanted at the right time to send a signal on his feast days. You can't have a total solar or lunar eclipse. Why do you think Rosh Hashanah is on the first day of the 7th month? So he could send a signal to us through a solar eclipse. Does that make sense? All right. Now, how many of you know there's been a lot of solar eclipses and lunar eclipses? The question is, do they happen on the feast days? That's when God wants to communicate to us. But if we're not on the biblical calendar, we don't even know when these feast days occurred, let alone if there's been an eclipse and he's trying to tell us something. So with that in mind, let me also explain to you this. In Zechariah, this is chapter 8. I'm going to put up this next little clip here. In Zechariah chapter 8:19, it says, "Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the fast of the 4th month," you see that right at the top, the fast of the 4th month, the fast of the 5th month, the fast of the 7th month, the fast of the 10th month, shall be to the house of Judah joy and gladness, cheerful feasts, therefore love truth and peace. You know the word feast there is moedim. In other words, God's going to turn these fast days into appointed times. Okay? Again, it doesn't mean a great time to eat. But here's the thing. You don't have to answer me, but is there anyone here who is not familiar what he's talking about here? Is everyone familiar? Does everyone know what he's talking about? Okay. Well, here's the thing. Every single one of these have to do with the destruction of the temple in 587 BC by Nebuchadnezzar. These are when these fasts started. They started then. They each have to do with an event that I'll tell you about here in just a minute. But there's very significance to these dates. But now look at this. How many of you are interested in prophecy? Anyone here interested in prophecy? Okay. Well, this is a prophecy right here, not from Zechariah. It's from God himself. It says the Lord is telling you that these fast days are going to become feast days. Well, guess what? If you don't know anything about them and they get turned into a feast day, how are you going to know that prophecy's been fulfilled? You don't even know when it is. So if you're interested in prophecy and you've thrown out the whole Old Testament, there's a whole lot of prophecies that are based on the biblical calendar. You don't even know when these prophecies are fulfilled or where we're at in biblical history or the prophetic time frame. So let's look at these. The fast of the 4th month is the 17th of Tammuz, and that's when Nebuchadnezzar broke down the walls to get to Jerusalem. The fast of the 5th month is the 9th of Av, okay? And the 9th of Av is when the temple was destroyed and everything was burnt down. The fast of the 7th month is when Gedaliah was killed, that Nebuchadnezzar had made governor. I should have had the 10th month up at the top because the fast of the 10th month, think of this is not correct, but I'm just telling you for the Greek mindset to help. Let's say the 10th month is October. Okay, it's not, but I'm just giving you an idea here. And let's say the 4th month is April or whatever. It was in winter that Nebuchadnezzar surrounded Jerusalem. It was called the 10th of the month of Tevet. On the 10th of Tevet, Nebuchadnezzar surrounded it. But think of the 10th of the month as being at the top of the previous year. So he surrounded Jerusalem on the 10th of Tevet. And then, the 6 months later in the 4th month, he broke through the walls. 5th month, he destroyed the temple, appointed Gedaliah. The 7th month, Gedaliah was killed. But here's the thing that's amazing. I don't know how many of you have not heard of the 17th of Tammuz, but the 17th of Tammuz was the day they worshiped the golden calf. And because that was the day they worshiped the golden calf, that day has become a curse throughout all of history. This is why on the 17th of Tammuz, Nebuchadnezzar surrounded the temple, or broke through the walls, to destroy it. Do you know it was on the 17th of Tammuz that Rome, 600 years later, broke through the walls to destroy Jerusalem in 70 AD? Well, guess what? In 2007, the Lebanon War that happened, when the missiles were coming from the north, it happened on the 17th of Tammuz, the same day they were fasting because of the worshiping of the golden calf. The same day Nebuchadnezzar broke through the northern walls, the missiles are flying over the northern walls. The 9th of Av is the very day the 10 spies brought the bad report that they couldn't take the land because of the giants. So the 9th of Av became a cursed day in history. This is the very day Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple, was on the 9th of Av. 600 years later, in 70 AD, the very same day Rome destroyed the temple on the 9th of Av. In 1290, all the Jews were kicked out of England on the 9th of Av. In 1492, all the Jews were kicked out of Spain on the 9th of Av. World War I started on the 9th of Av. Hitler's proclamation to kill the Jews was on the 9th of Av. They evacuated the Gaza Strip, giving away the Promised Land in 2005 at sunset on the 9th of Av. But if you're not on the biblical calendar, you're not seeing the connections. This is why we want to be on God's calendar. Okay, this is the Babylonians destroying the temple, Rome destroying the temple. So the thing I want to emphasize, again, is being on God's calendar. The spring feast were all fulfilled at his first coming. Okay, the 50 days to the counting of the Omer, he ascended on the 40th day. Pentecost was fulfilled on Pentecost. Okay, then we have this bridge to the fall feast. The purpose is his two comings, his first coming and his second coming. Okay, so now that we recognize, I hope everyone understands the significance of God's calendar, and I hope you understand the whole concept of these eclipses that are coming on God's calendar. What would you say if I told you now that you have a better understanding, if there were 4 total blood moons coming back to back, right in a row, and falling on the feast days? Here's what we have coming. In 2014, on Passover, we have a full blood moon, April 15th of 2014. October 8th, we have a total lunar eclipse on the first day of Sukkot. And March 20th of 2015, on Adar 29, Nisan 1, if you remember, God told Moses that Nisan is going to be the beginning of the religious calendar year, right? Tishri 1 is the beginning of the civil year, or Rosh Hashanah. Nisan 1 is the very day Moses set up the tabernacle, the fire fell from heaven, the glory fell. So here, beginning the religious year in 2015, there is a total solar eclipse on that very important biblical day. 2 weeks later, on Passover, a total lunar eclipse on Passover, another solar eclipse on Rosh Hashanah, and then another total lunar eclipse on Sukkot. That is what is coming starting next spring. Now, how this basically started, I was in my prayer closet. I was just praying and asking God. I had seen in March of 2008 this total lunar eclipse over the Temple Mount. And I was remembering these verses, that there would be signs in the sun and the moon and the stars. And so I went to NASA's website. Now, here's one thing I want to point out because of different things people have said. They said, this is my theory. NASA is not a theory. This is math. How many of you know I do not control an eclipse? Okay, this is not a theory. It is not a theory. It is a fact that these are happening on this day. It is a fact that they are happening on the biblical calendar. Now, how you want to interpret these events, I tell people you can put it in your own theological pipe and smoke it like you want. Okay? But I noticed in 2014 and 2015, right here, let's put these blood moons down. There's another one underneath. I should have made this a little bit smaller. But here's where you have these 4 blood moons in a row. And I was looking at that, and I thought, well, how often do you get 4 total lunar eclipses in a row? That's, as a mathematician, I like looking at these things. Well, guess what? There were not 4 lunar eclipses in a row in the 1800s. There was none in the 1700s. There was none in the 1600s. Okay? So they're not common. But now, in the 1500s, it happened 7 times there were 4 blood moons in a row. But guess what? They didn't all fall on the feast days. So now we're going to just like, I don't know if it's double or triple the odds. Not only what are the odds of having 4 in a row, what are the odds that all 4 fall on feast days? Okay, so that's another significant event. So I saw these 4 total lunar eclipses, and I thought, oh my goodness. And then when all of a sudden it hit me, I was looking at April and September and October, and all of a sudden it hit me, you goofball, you got to put these on the biblical calendar. So I switched to the biblical calendar and saw they were falling on these feast days. Okay, well now my next thing I got excited about as I was looking at this, okay, well when was the last time that you not only had 4 blood moons in a row, but they also happened on Passover and Sukkot? The last time was 1967 when Israel captured Jerusalem. In 1968. So now I'm getting excited thinking, oh my goodness, here we are. Jerusalem has been recaptured, and on Passover and Sukkot, you have 2 years in a row these blood moons. God was sending a signal saying, hello, this has to do with me. That make sense? How about the time before that? The time before that was 1948 when they became a nation. What do you have? Passover and Sukkot. You've got a total lunar eclipse both times. So now I'm thinking, good grief. What are the odds that here you don't have 4 blood moons in a row? You have it in the 1900s. Both times it has to do with Israel prophetically big time. It doesn't happen in the 1800s, doesn't happen in the 1700s, doesn't happen in the 1600s, it doesn't happen in the 1500s that they fall on the feast days. The next time it happened, remember 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue? Most people don't know he was Jewish, and it was a boatload of Jews that were leaving town because they were all kicked out of Spain on the 9th of Av. These were a boatload of Jews hightailing it out of there. His cartographer was Jewish. A lot of the people were Jewish. Well, guess what? 4 blood moons, 1493, 1494, Passover and Sukkot, Passover and Sukkot. So for me, it's like, good grief. I'm looking at this thing. God said he's going to send signals on his feast days by signs in the sun and the moon, and then all of a sudden, and also in 70 AD, if you go back and look, you're going to see eclipses all over 70 AD. God is sending. We have to know his signals. We have to know his signs. What is he trying to tell us? Okay. So here we see, coming up in 2015, which is going to be very significant, we have the solar lunar eclipses. Because here's the thing, when I looked at this, I said, well, God has to be 100% accurate. There has to be signs in the sun as well, not just the moon. And so I looked, and it's like, good grief, we got signs that the sun is turned to sackcloth, the moon to blood. Okay, so now, I think what greater divine signal could be given than this, than the fact that Jerusalem is taken back and Israel's become a nation. Now from Joel, look at something here, chapter 2, verse 31, it talks about how the sun will be turned to darkness, the moon to blood before the great and terrible day of the Lord. So, anyway, the point is this. To me, all these signs coming together at one time, and I think I have that. Let me look at this. This is where everything falls at once. But here we go. Here's what we got coming. All these are all on feast days, guys. This hasn't happened in history for several hundred years. You have all these eclipses that are happening. They happened in 2008. You had even Venus going around a week before Shavuot, around this, eclipsing the sun. I mean, there's so many signs in the heavens that are all tied to the feast days, and they're all culminating right here at one time. I think this is signaling God is about to close this chapter of human history. This is the final curtain call. Very well could be before the Great Tribulation mentioned in the Bible. But God has always wanted to warn his people and the rest of the world before he intervenes. And what better way to communicate this to the world but through the universal language that speaks to every tribe, nation, and tongue. So all I can say, hold on to your shorts. Thank you very much.